A new world order is emerging, and with it the foundations of a new and progressive era of international cooperation.
After a tsunami of hype, it's time to really put in perspective all the smiles behind the new world order announced at the G20 in London. Professor Michael Hudson of the University of Missouri, he could not be more explicit. Neoliberal logic still rules. And if you don't accept the IMF's kiss of death, he writes, the alternative is for debtor countries to suffer the same kind of economic sanctions as Iran, Cuba, and pre-invasion Iraq. So maybe this is a better reflection of the new world order. A world where it's our gain, your pain, and a leading story tells us capitalism isn't really democracy. Yes, this is a Financial Times spoof distributed in Waterloo Station in London during the G20. What kind of new world order is this when countries of the mostly poor South are net creditors of the rich North? The US foreign debt at over $6 trillion is twice the total foreign debt of all the countries of the South. These countries, they should be fleeing the IMF, or at least auditing the debts they'll be asked to repay. Before the G20 in London, the Global Europe Anticipation Bulletin, the GEAB, in other words, European elites, that's elite thinking circulating among diplomats, politicians, investors, they were alerting that either we create the conditions for a new global system, and then the crisis would not last more than 5 years, or if we stick to the current system, the crisis will turn the 2010s into a lost decade. So imagine what will happen to this chart, illustrating the prevailing sense of doom in the US. In a letter published in the Financial Times, this European think tank had a few crucial suggestions. Number one, create a new global reserve currency based on a basket of currencies. Well, China and other emerging markets, they couldn't even get the US to discuss this possibility, even though the US economy and the dollar are fragile. Number two, get the IMF to examine the US, the UK, and the Swiss banking systems. That one was a no-go during the G20. And number three, write a simple and short statement. Well, the communique had 10 pages. While the G20 sounded like an Obama credit boom with fake money, the global depression rolls on, as this policy analysis website shows. Even though
the old Washington consensus is over. Today we have reached a new consensus.
The London consensus may not fare much better. Already before the G20, the GAB, that European think tank we mentioned, they were projecting what may happen next. The system may disintegrate, and global political dislocation, in other words, chaos, may be just around the corner. This amazing story details the crusade led by former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, former Goldman Sachs CEO Robert Rubin, that's Obama's Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner's mentor, we should remember, and Larry Summers in the late 1990s, during the Clinton administration, to prevent any regulation whatsoever of the derivatives market. And that's the key source of the global financial crisis. They all said the financial industry was against it. Today we all know the crisis mostly derives from a certain derivative, the famous credit default swap, CDS. Here's what William Black, the man who cracked down on banks during the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s and who wrote this book, told Bill Moyers.
We passed a law because there was a very good regulator, Brooksley Born, that everybody should know about, probably doesn't. She tried to do the right thing to regulate one of these exotic derivatives that you're talking about. We call them CDS. And Summers, Rubin, and Phil Graham came together to say not only will we block this particular regulation, we will pass a law that says you can't regulate. And it's this type of derivative that is most involved in the AIG scandal. And AIG all by itself costs the same as the entire savings and loan debacle. Sure, the cover-up.
It's a serious charge.
Of course.
Who's covering up?
Geithner is covering up, just like Paulson did before him. Geithner is publicly saying that it's going to take $2 trillion. A trillion is 1,000 billion, right? 2 trillion taxpayer dollars to deal with this problem. But they're allowing all the banks to report that they're not only solvent, but fully capitalized. Both statements can't be true. It can't be that they need 2 trillion because they have massive losses and that they're fine. These are all people who have failed. Paulson failed, Geithner failed. They were all promoted because they failed, not because they had succeeded. Well, Geithner was one of our nation's top regulators during the entire subprime scandal that I've just described. He took absolutely no effective action. He gave no warning. He did nothing in response to the FBI warning that there was an epidemic of fraud. All this pig-in-the-poke stuff happened under him. So in his phrase about legacy assets, well, he's a failed legacy regulator.
So President Lula of Brazil's metaphor was, after all, more than correct. But nobody ever thought about the scale of it all. Something like $1 quadrillion of derivatives. Yes, a pyramid of $1,000 trillion. So make no mistake, fear struck the US ruling elites. And this led to the US government and the Fed giving $10 trillion to big banks. No wonder George Soros, who knows one or two things about money, is now scared of zombie banks sucking the lifeblood out of the economy. This whole thing also led to a new, over $500 billion strong Pentagon budget, 4% higher than the last Pentagon budget under George W. Bush. And this also led to the new chapter of the Pentagon's long war, the AfPak war.
I also want to be clear that America's relationship with the Muslim community, the Muslim world, cannot and will not just be based upon opposition to terrorism.
Excellent. But the fact remains, the AfPak war is a guaranteed stimulus package for the industrial military complex. The rest of the world sees it all very differently. Beyond the G20, this is what developing countries are worried about. Number one, a tsunami of surplus dollars traveling the world in financial speculation overdrive. Number two, the fact that central banks have to recycle these dollars to buy US Treasury bonds and thus finance the huge US budget deficit, now 13% of the US GDP. And number three, the military character of the US deficits. The New World Order can be glimpsed in developing countries. They are trying some other very, very serious options. Example, the petrocurrency discussed at a recent meeting between the leaders of South America and the Arab League. The GEAB, that European think tank we mentioned, they call it the Khalij. It could be out in circulation by January 2010. And a new world order is visible in things like China lending in yuan to Argentina. That's a swap deal. This means that China is lending some of its huge reserves in foreign currency directly to its trade partners. And what about some practical consequences of the new world order? Stay tuned for the second part of this report.
There are times when reality just asserts itself, in spite of the haze created by television news and entertainment. Sometimes crisis rips a tear in the fabric of myth and propaganda. Now a profound economic crisis has ripped asunder the American dream itself. Millions of people losing jobs and homes. They lack proper health care and any real sense of security. Since 2001, workers' wages have fallen or remained stagnant, even though worker productivity has risen almost 33%. By 2006, the top 1% of households were receiving 23% of all pre-tax income, more than double what it was in the 1970s. It's the greatest concentration of income since 1928. As unemployment rises, we need to know why this crisis is happening and what we can do to defend ourselves. Why are wages so low? Why is the society so laden with debt? Is it in ordinary Americans' interest to have $1 trillion military budget to project power across the globe? Corporate television news won't ask these questions, let alone try to find answers. Only a truly independent news network can tackle these questions with courage and with ordinary people's interests in mind. We need a news network that's independent of corporations, governments, and political parties. We need the real news. But there won't be a real news network unless we raise substantial funds right away. The current financial crisis has hit our funding hard. Together, we do have the power to turn it around. There are already hundreds of thousands of people watching the real news every month. If everyone pitches in, we can build an internet and cable television network that will change the face of media forever. You can organize house parties, talk to friends at school and at work, send email blasts and spread the word. Distribute this video to everyone you know. Pick up the phone and call a few friends and suggest they visit therealnews.com. Invest just 10 minutes a day to ask friends and colleagues to join the campaign to create a truly independent source of internet and television news. Together, we can build this network. Just 50,000 people at $10 a month gets us to our first level of sustainability. You can help us reach this goal, and when we do, we'll move to television in millions of homes across North America. Help us reach an audience in the millions. Please contribute generously. Spread the word. Let's make the Real News television network a reality.
Your tax-deductible donation makes it possible. Please contribute at therealnews.com.